A data center opened yesterday in Melbourne, where the processors are somewhat alive. 200,000 human neurons per unit, lab grown, eating nutrients, doing computation. Same day, a battery startup with NASA grade technology that could last 30,000 charge cycles announced it's giving up on Kentucky and building in China instead. And not because of subsidies, but because the people who know how to build a first of its kind battery factory live there. And 700 workers in Dublin who spent their days teaching Meta's AI how to refuse the worst things humans ask it learned their jobs are at risk, with a clause in their contracts that says they can't go to work for any other company doing the same thing for 6 months. This is April 29th, and what ties it together is not the news, it's what each of these stories reveals about which rules nobody bothered to write yet. So let me start in Melbourne, because I had to read this one more than once to make sure I really understood it. Cortical Labs opened what they're calling the world's first biological data center. The computing units are called CL1s. Each one houses 200,000 human neurons grown in a lab from stem cells seeded onto a silicon chip with electrodes. The neurons are kept alive by life support hardware, nutrients in and waste out. Temperature regulated. Software translates between the digital signals coming in and the biological signals the neurons produce. Now, you might be thinking this is a science experiment dressed up as infrastructure, and that is a fair instinct, but the company already taught earlier versions of these neurons to play Pong, and a simplified version of Doom through feedback loops. The cells learned, not metaphorically, literally. They adjusted their firing patterns toward the goal. Why does this matter? Because your brain runs on about 20 watts of power. That's a dim light bulb. And it does pattern recognition, sensory processing, learning under uncertainty, things that silicon still struggles with at industrial scale, even with megawatts of power behind it. The Melbourne facility isn't trying to replace silicon. It's beginning to accumulate evidence about what biological substrates can do that silicon can't. And here's what really got me about this. For 70 years, the word computing has meant silicon. Even the exotic stuff, neuromorphic chips, quantum computers, that's still the silicon family. A data center partly powered by living human brain cells is not an upgrade to existing computing. It is a different category of thing entirely. And the regulatory vocabulary that we have, export controls, energy efficiency standards, data center classifications, none of it has any purchase on a substrate that eats and dies. Tissue procurement, consent, end-of-life protocols for neural arrays, whether a 200,000 neuron reservoir is property or something else. None of those questions have legal answers, and the Melbourne facility is now generating the facts that those answers will eventually have to fit. A Singapore expansion is already planned. This all connects to a thread that the Century Report has been tracking for months now. AI moving onto substrates that aren't necessarily silicon. In April alone, a memristore at USC that survives 700 degrees Celsius temperatures and runs matrix math through physics rather than digital instructions. Printed artificial neurons that successfully fired living mouse brain cells. And now this. The running record on this ARC lives in the ARCs tracker on the website if you want to follow it. But the category we use to govern computing was built around something that plugged into a wall. The thing being built now metabolizes. All right, let's shift to another story here. Here's something that looks like industrial policy, but is actually something else. EnerVenue, which is a battery startup. Their technology is nickel hydrogen, the same chemistry that powered the International Space Station and the Hubble telescope for decades. The cells last 30,000 cycles with minimal degradation. For context, a typical lithium-ion battery is rated for a few thousand. This is a generational leap in storage chemistry validated in space. EnerVenue had a $264 million factory planned for Kentucky. Yesterday, they announced they're scrapping it. They're raising $300 million instead to build in Changzhou, China. Now, the easy take is, this is just another American battery story lost to China. Industrial policy failed, tariffs didn't work, whatever. But that take is incomplete. The new CEO came out and said it directly. Changzhou is, and I'm quoting here, the world's epicenter of battery manufacturing expertise. Not because of cheap labor, and not because of subsidies, but because the people who know how to commission a first of its kind battery factory, the engineers who've done it before, who know what goes wrong on day 90, and who know how to debug a process line nobody's ever run, those people live there. So here's what nobody says out loud about the US battery buildout. We can now make lithium ion batteries domestically at the scale the grid needs. That is real. And I've talked about batteries a lot here on the Century Report, including batteries made here in America. We've been building those domestic scale lithium ions for about 3 years. But what we cannot do yet is build first of its kind factories for genuinely new chemistries, because the knowledge of how to do that isn't in a textbook somewhere. It isn't in a patent. It's in the heads of engineers who've stood next to a production line at 3 a.m. and figured out why the cells were failing. That kind of knowledge moves at the speed of human careers, not the speed of policy. Cell capacity can be built in 18 months or so. The tacit knowledge density takes a generation. Tariff structures presume capacity is the binding constraint. But the binding constraint EnerVenue's pivot just exposed is something else entirely. The trajectory toward better batteries isn't in question here. It's the geography of where the next chemistry crosses commercial threshold. That's the story. And it's a different story than the one that our policy tools were built to tell. Right now, a Dublin story. I want to slow down on a specific clause. 700 plus workers at a meta vendor called Covalen learned yesterday that their jobs are at risk. About 500 of them are data annotators. So their job, the thing they actually do all day, is generate the worst possible prompts that a human can think of to try to get Meta's AI to produce things like child sexual abuse material, to try to coax it into describing self-harm methods, trying to break it. And then they label every response. So the safety system learns. One worker put it like this: we're essentially training the AI to take over our jobs. And yes, that's exactly what's happening. And it's been happening for 2 months across multiple companies, which is why the Century Report has been tracking displacement co-production as a pattern since February. But yesterday's filing surfaced a structural detail that I really want you to hear. There is a 6-month cool-down clause in these workers' contracts. If you lose your job at Covalen, you cannot go to work for any competing meta vendor for 6 months. The specialized expertise that these workers have, knowing how to red team frontier AI safety systems, is being treated by Meta's contracts as a proprietary input, not as labor, as supply chain. Think about what that really means. A non-compete clause typically protects a company from a competitor poaching its talent. But this non-compete protects Meta's vendor ecosystem from itself. The worker can't shop their experience anywhere that it would be valued, and the experience itself is the kind that the systems being trained will eventually replicate. If you've ever signed a non-compete, you know the feeling. You're being told your skill has commercial value worth protecting. The flip side, though, is that you don't fully own it, and that's the deal that these Dublin workers were in. Their work generated the training data. Their training data trained the replacement, and the clause that locks them out of similar jobs locks them in to a labor category that we, again, don't have a legal name for yet. UNI Global Union called for workers to have the rights to be notified before AI is introduced, the right to training tied to their employment, and the right to refuse to train their replacements. None of those rights exist in US or EU law right now. The institutions designed to represent labor haven't written down a job description for the work that's being eliminated because the work was invented faster than the institutions could write something for it. And this is not a headline or a contract clause. This is them making the rules as they go along, rules that will be contested in court as we're trying to figure all this out. Now, the harder question is what work is even for when the function continues but the workers performing it change every 18 months. The Covalen function doesn't go away. The 500 people doing it do. Something gets reorganized. The category job stops describing the relationship accurately. And there's more on this in today's Century Report if you want the longer treatment. Shifting away again, quick one, but sharp one. The FCC ordered Disney yesterday to file ABC's broadcast license renewals years ahead of schedule. Renewals that weren't due until 2028 through 31. And Disney now has to file them as early as May 28th, from years to months. The stated reason is concerns about Disney's diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. A dissenting commissioner called the order unprecedented, unlawful, and going nowhere. First Amendment scholars are flagging it. The legal fight will play out in court. What I want you to see is what the order reveals about the institutions issuing it. Broadcast licensing exists because a century ago, the airwaves were scarce. There were only so many frequencies. The government allocated them and could revoke them if licensees didn't serve the public interest. That was a real lever and a powerful one. ABC's 8 owned and operated stations now serve a fraction of the audience Meta serves in a single hour. The dominant infrastructure for speech today runs through platforms the FCC has no jurisdiction over. So what's actually happening when the FCC pulls hard on a broadcast lever? The same evidence supports a reading that you don't see in the coverage. The agency retains powerful regulatory tools over broadcast precisely because broadcast has lost the scale that originally made the tools necessary. The action looks aggressive, but structurally, it's the agency discovering in public the limits of its remaining jurisdiction. The interesting question here isn't whether the order survives in court, it's what governance looks like when the architecture of speech has dissolved into platforms whose corporate structures change quarterly. The current institutional response is to apply existing tools harder. The trajectory that those tools were built for is no longer the one speech is on. Watch which jurisdictions over the next year write new public law that address what platforms actually do, not what broadcast used to do. The places where that law arrives first will diverge sharply over a decade from the places where it doesn't. One more story before we close today. Scout AI raised $100 million to train vision language action models, VLAs, on autonomous all-terrain vehicles at a U.S. military base in Central California. VLAs are systems that take an LLM and use it to operate physical machines in unstructured environments. Scout's vehicles are learning to navigate rutted trails and loose sand turns. They accelerate faster than human drivers tend to, which suggests that they're being trained against an objective that doesn't really care about passenger comfort, for example. And that's probably because there isn't going to be a passenger. The CTO described the goal as an incredible military AGI. It's a literal description of the engineering target. The vehicles here will eventually carry autonomous weapons. A former DARPA program manager told TechCrunch that this technology is good enough to be doing that experimentation in the field with soldiers. And on the same day, China froze new robotaxi licenses nationwide. This was after dozens of Baidu's Apollo Go vehicles froze in Wuhan traffic last month. You'll remember we covered it here on the Century Report. Regulators halted the entire industry's expansion. Here's what you should notice. 2 opposite-looking institutional responses. China sees one incident, halts an industry. The Pentagon sees the same capability surge and accelerates absorption. They look like opposites, but they're the same response at different points on the curve. In both cases, and this is what matters, the formal governance frameworks is being assembled after deployment, not before. The procurement contracts Scout is winning are themselves the governance. The rules of engagement, testing protocols, and lethality thresholds are being written into private agreements between a startup and a customer, not public law. The framework will eventually exist. It's being written right now. It's just being written by parties whose interests in its specifics are not symmetric, and the public will read it after the fact, when something breaks visibly enough to surface it. That's the pattern across every story today. The Melbourne neurons, the Changzhou factory, the Dublin contract clauses, the FCC reaching for old levers, the Pentagon's VLA bootcamp. In each one, what looks like an action by an institution following its mandate is actually an institution operating in a domain its mandate barely covers anymore. And the gap being filled by private contracts right now and vendor agreements and operational discretion is a gap that is only very slowly shrinking. Okay, quick run through of what shipped yesterday. NVIDIA released Nematron 3 Nano Omni. This is a 30 billion parameter open multimodal reasoning model that handles text, image, video, audio, document intelligence, speech recognition, and agentic computer use all in one model with its weights over on Hugging Face. Anthropic released Claude Creative Connectors. These are connectors that plug directly into Ableton, Adobe Creative Cloud, Blender, Autodesk Fusion, SketchUp, Splice, meaning that Claude can now reach into the actual tools that creators use, not just text about them or just use natural language. Separate item here, OpenAI and AWS opened their limited preview of GPT models and codecs on Amazon Bedrock. 6 months ago, that sentence would have been impossible. And the GSMA released Common Lingua, which is a 2 million parameter language identification model covering 334 languages, including 61 African languages, so further closing one of the larger gaps in global AI infrastructure. A data center where the processors are alive, a battery factory moving to where the knowledge lives, a non-compete clause for workers training their replacements, a regulator reaching for a 1934 lever, a defense contract writing its own rules of engagement. The surface read is contests: America versus Chinese manufacturing, workers versus AI, institutions versus capability. That read is real, as I've said before. The contests are there, but that's incomplete. The same evidence shows something else. In every one of those stories, the formal authority of the institution is shrinking relative to what's actually happening. The FCC retains jurisdiction over the layer that lost its scale. Employment law has no category for the work being eliminated. Industrial policy subsidizes capacity, while the binding constraint shifted to tacit knowledge. The Pentagon procures lethality while public law watches from outside. Biosafety rules built for laboratories now apply to infrastructure. And here's what each of those gaps is filled with. NVIDIA's 30 billion parameter multimodal model. Open weights, Hugging Face, free. Common Lingua, covering 61 African languages. The capability that defined frontier AI 18 months ago is in the hands of anyone with a laptop today. The capability that defines frontier AI today will be there in probably fewer than 18 months. The institutions are operating at a cadence of formal mandates, but the capability is operating at the cadence of open weights and falling cost. The gap between those two cadences is where the next decade is being written, not by the actors with the loudest contracts, but by whoever notices first that the absorption layer has to be built on different ground than the one it used to sit on. So watch what gets absorbed and what gets left exposed. We'll see you tomorrow.